Red and blue lights fractured the heavy Texas darkness, reflecting off the polished frame of a government-issued sedan. Inside sat a man holding the key to humanity's next lunar mission, only to be stopped by an officer looking for a quick, prejudiced victory. What started as a textbook case of racial profiling is about to become a federal incident. One unjustified traffic stop, one encrypted phone call, and within minutes, an entire interstate will be paralyzed by federal agents. The rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets across Interstate 45, turning the asphalt into a black mirror that swallowed the headlights of the few cars brave enough to be on the road at 1:15 in the morning. Inside his deep blue Audi A6, Dr. David Caldwell kept his eyes locked on the white dashed lines, the soft rhythm of a John Coltrane track playing through the speakers, doing little to calm the adrenaline buzzing in his chest. David was a man who understood pressure. At 42 years old, he held a PhD in aerospace engineering from MIT and served as the lead propulsion systems specialist for NASA's Artemis III mission at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. He spent his days calculating orbital mechanics, thrust-to-weight ratios, and cryogenic fluid dynamics. He was one of the brightest minds of his generation, a man who built machines designed to slip the surly bonds of Earth. But right now, his entire universe was condensed into the metallic, military-grade Pelican case sitting securely buckled into the passenger seat beside him. Inside that case was a beryllium core navigation transducer. It was a one-of-a-kind, $40 million prototype component that had taken 3 years and a team of 70 engineers to perfect. Less than 2 hours ago, David had received a frantic call from the Houston testing facility. A catastrophic sensor failure had occurred during a simulation. If they didn't get this specific replacement transducer integrated into the command module's mainframe before the cryogenic seals locked at 4 a.m., the entire launch window would be delayed by 6 months, costing the federal government billions of dollars. David had personally retrieved the component from a secure auxiliary lab in Austin. The case was temperature-controlled, biometrically sealed, and armed with a GPS tracker monitored directly by the Department of Homeland Security. He was 60 miles outside of Houston. The rain drummed heavily against the roof of the Audi. He adjusted his grip on the leather steering wheel, his mind running through the installation protocols he would have to execute the moment he arrived. He was dressed in a crisp white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, a dark blue tie loosened around his neck. Exhaustion pulled at the corners of his eyes, but duty kept him sharp. Then, the darkness of the highway was shattered. It wasn't a warning. It was an explosion of violently flashing red and blue lights, filling his rearview mirror, accompanied by the aggressive, ear-piercing chirp of a police siren. David's heart performed a familiar, sickening drop. It was a visceral reaction, one completely divorced from his education, his security clearance, or his vital mission. It was the ancestral instinct of a black man, alone, on a dark southern highway in the middle of the night. He immediately checked his speedometer. He was going 65 in a 70-mile-per-hour zone. His tags were up to date. His turn signals worked. There was absolutely no legal reason for him to be pulled over. But the cruiser rode his bumper, the high beams blinding him through the rearview mirror, aggressive and impatient. Taking a deep breath to steady his pulse, David activated his right turn signal and carefully guided the Audi onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The car rolled to a gentle stop. He put the vehicle in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down the driver's side window. The damp, chilly Texas air rushed into the cabin, smelling of ozone and wet pine. Protocol. He knew the protocol. He turned on the interior cabin lights so the officer could see inside. He placed both of his hands on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not reach for his glove compartment. He sat perfectly still, waiting. In the side mirror, he watched the driver's door of the police cruiser swing open. A figure stepped out into the rain. The officer didn't hurry. He walked with a slow, deliberate saunter that spoke of absolute, unquestioned authority. A heavy maglite flashlight was gripped in his right hand. David watched the silhouette approach. He had no way of knowing that the man walking toward his car was Officer Bradley Jenkins of the State Highway Patrol. Jenkins was a man who had built a career on intimidation. A 12-year veteran of the force with a personnel file thick with excessive force, complaints and racial profiling grievances that had all been conveniently swept under the rug by his union representatives. Jenkins liked the night shift. He liked the power of the badge in the dark, where there were no witnesses, no cameras, and no one to challenge his absolute rule over his stretch of asphalt. Jenkins stopped just behind the driver's side door, intentionally staying out of David's direct line of sight, a tactical move designed to force the driver to turn and look up at him. The heavy beam of the maglite smashed into the cabin, blindingly bright, sweeping over David's face, his clothes, the pristine interior of the Audi, and finally coming to a dead stop on the locked Pelican case resting on the passenger seat. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," a voice barked from behind the wall of white light. The tone was harsh, dripping with unearned condescension. David squinted against the glare, keeping his hands firmly planted on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. My wallet is in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I need to reach for them. Is that all right?" Jenkins scoffed, a wet, ugly sound over the drumming rain. "Just get the papers, boy, and no sudden movements." The word hung in the damp air. Boy. It was a deliberate choice, a verbal strike designed to establish hierarchy, to strip David of his adulthood, his dignity, and his status. David's jaw tightened, but his expression remained a mask of professional calm. He slowly reached into his back pocket, extracted his leather wallet, and then leaned over to pop open the glove box. He handed the documents out the window. Jenkins snatched them, the flashlight beam still pinned to David's eyes. David Caldwell. Jenkins read slowly, intentionally butchering the cadence of the name. He leaned in closer, bringing the smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco into the car. "That's a mighty nice car for a guy out driving at 1 a.m, Dave. This your vehicle?" "Yes, officer," David replied evenly. "It is registered in my name, as the paperwork shows." "Right. And where exactly are you headed in such a hurry on a night like this?" "I'm en route to the Johnson Space Center in Houston," David said. "I am an aerospace engineer with NASA. It is a matter of urgent federal business." Jenkins let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He lowered the flashlight slightly, revealing a face set in a permanent sneer. Rain dripped from the brim of his campaign hat. "NASA? An engineer?" Jenkins leaned his forearms against the window frame, invading David's space. "You expect me to believe that? You look more like a guy running product up from the border to me. Let me see some ID. Real ID, not this driver's license." "My federal identification badge is in my jacket pocket on the passenger seat," David said carefully. "Get it." David leaned over, reached into his suit jacket resting behind the Pelican case, and pulled out his NASA Level 6 security clearance badge. It was a heavy, holographic card that granted him access to some of the most restricted military and scientific installations in the country. He handed it to Jenkins. Jenkins took the badge, shined his light on it, and rubbed his thumb over the holographic seal. Then, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed the badge back through the window. It bounced off David's chest and landed in the footwell. "Anybody can buy a piece of plastic on the internet, Dave," Jenkins said. "You think I'm stupid? You think I haven't seen every trick in the book?" "Officer," David said, his voice dropping an octave, finding a firm, authoritative anchor. "I am currently transporting a critical, highly classified federal component. I am on a strict timetable. If you would like to call dispatch and verify my credentials through the federal database, I strongly suggest you do so now. But I need to get back on the road." Jenkins's eyes narrowed. The calm defiance in David's voice infuriated him. Men like Jenkins did not know how to process a black man who was neither terrified nor aggressive, but simply unaffected by their intimidation tactics. The flashlight beam snapped back to the passenger seat, illuminating the metallic Pelican case. The case was covered in highly visible, red and white, federal tamper warning stickers. "What's in the box?" Jenkins demanded. "That is classified federal property," David replied. "I am not at liberty to discuss its contents, nor am I authorized to open it outside of a Class 100 clean room environment." "Classified federal property," Jenkins mocked, taking a step back and resting his hand aggressively on the butt of his holstered sidearm. "You know what I think, Dave? I think you're a smart-ass drug runner with a fake badge and a trunk full of fentanyl. I think that fancy box is full of cartel cash. Now, step out of the vehicle." David did not move immediately. "Officer Jenkins, I am formally advising you that detaining me will result in a severe disruption to a federal spaceflight operation. If you open that case, you will destroy a $40 million component and commit a federal crime." "Step out of the damn car, now!" Jenkins roared, unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. The threat of lethal violence was sudden and absolute. David knew the reality of the situation. He was on a dark, isolated highway with an armed man who was actively looking for an excuse to pull the trigger. No amount of MIT degrees or federal clearances could stop a bullet. Moving slowly, telegraphing every motion, David unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the freezing rain. Before he could even find his footing on the slippery shoulder, Jenkins grabbed him roughly by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming David's chest and face against the wet roof of the Audi. "Spread your legs!" Jenkins yelled, kicking David's ankles apart. He aggressively patted David down, his hands roaming forcefully over David's sides and pockets. Finding no weapons, Jenkins grabbed David's wrists, yanked them painfully behind his back, and clamped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto them, ratcheting them tight enough to bite into the skin. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," David said, his cheek pressed against the cold, wet metal of his car. "Shut up," Jenkins hissed in his ear. "You're under arrest for suspicion of trafficking. Now let's see what you're really hiding in that fancy box." Jenkins hauled David backward, dragging him by the chain of the handcuffs through the mud and gravel, and shoved him forcefully into the back seat of the police cruiser. The doors slammed shut. The rear compartment smelled of old sweat, vomit, and cheap pine air freshener. There were no door handles on the inside. David was trapped. Through the rain-streaked windshield of the cruiser, David watched in mounting horror as Jenkins walked back to the Audi, reached into the cabin, and dragged the heavy Pelican case out into the rain. Jenkins set the case on the hood of his cruiser, directly in the glare of the headlights. He wiped the rain from his eyes and looked down at the box. There was no keyhole. The case was secured by a biometric thumbprint scanner and a 12-digit alphanumeric keypad. Jenkins tapped the scanner. A digital voice chirped from the case. "Unauthorized user. Access denied." Jenkins scowled. He pounded his fist against the reinforced polymer shell. It didn't even dent. Frustrated, the officer walked to the trunk of his cruiser, popped it open, and retrieved a heavy steel crowbar. Inside the cruiser, David's blood ran cold. The beryllium core transducer was suspended in a vacuum seal of liquid helium. If Jenkins breached the outer shell and shattered the vacuum matrix, the sudden exposure to the humid Texas air and ambient temperature would instantly corrupt the microcircuitry. 3 years of work, billions of dollars, and the safety of 4 astronauts were about to be destroyed by a racist cop with a pry bar. David leaned forward, maneuvering his handcuffed hands as best he could, and kicked the heavy plastic partition separating the front and back seats of the cruiser. Bang! 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 Jenkins paused, crowbar in hand, and glared through the windshield. He stomped over to the rear door and yanked it open, rain pouring into the back seat. "You got a death wish, boy?" Jenkins snarled, raising the crowbar slightly. "If you strike that case with that crowbar, it will trigger an explosive decompression of liquid helium." David lied seamlessly, his voice commanding and devoid of fear. He needed to buy time. "It will blow your hands off, and it will trigger an immediate distress beacon to the Department of Homeland Security. You are tampering with Level 8 restricted technology." Jenkins hesitated. The sheer authority in David's voice, combined with the impenetrable look of the high-tech case, planted a seed of doubt in the officer's arrogant mind. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You're full of it," Jenkins sneered, though his grip on the crowbar loosened. "Let me make one phone call," David demanded. "Before you ruin your life and destroy government property, let me make one phone call. Put it on speaker. If I am who you think I am, nobody will answer. But if I am telling the truth, you need to hear it from my director." Jenkins stared at him, the rain running down his face. He wanted to pry the box open. He wanted to prove the arrogant black man in the expensive suit was nothing but a criminal. But the mention of Homeland Security and exploding liquid helium had unsettled him. He wanted to humiliate David, to catch him in a lie. "Fine," Jenkins said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Who are we calling? Your cartel boss?" "Take my phone from my left jacket pocket," David instructed. "Face ID will unlock it. Call the contact listed as Director Lawson." Jenkins reached into the Audi, retrieved David's phone, and held it up to David's face. The screen unlocked. Jenkins found the contact, hit dial, and pressed the speakerphone button. He held the phone up, a smug look of anticipation on his face, waiting for a disconnected number or a sleepy accomplice. The phone rang twice, then it was answered. Not by a groggy civilian, but by a crisp, hyper-alert voice backed by the hum of dozens of voices and ringing alarms. "Caldwell, where the hell are you?" the voice barked. It was Dr. Henrietta Lawson, the Deputy Director of Flight Operations at NASA. She was currently standing in the center of Mission Control in Houston, staring at a giant digital countdown clock ticking toward 4 a.m. "Telemetry shows you stopped moving on I-45 12 minutes ago. We are 22 minutes from thermal lock on the command module. Do you have the payload?" Jenkins's smug smile vanished. He stared at the phone. "Director Lawson," David said loudly, his voice projecting clearly into the phone. "This is Dr. Caldwell. I am currently detained on the side of Interstate 45 South, near mile marker 112. I have been placed in handcuffs by a state highway patrol officer. The officer has seized the payload and is currently attempting to pry the biometric containment case open with a steel crowbar." There was dead silence on the line for exactly 3 seconds. When Henrietta Lawson spoke again, the ambient noise of Mission Control behind her had vanished, replaced by an eerie, terrifying quiet. Her voice was pure ice. "Officer," Henrietta said, her tone carrying the weight of the entire federal government. "I do not know your name, and frankly, I do not care. My name is Dr. Henrietta Lawson. I am the acting director of operations for the Artemis III lunar program. You are currently in possession of a Department of Defense classified orbital transducer. If you so much as scratch the paint on that case, you will not only be fired, you will be prosecuted under the Espionage Act and the Patriot Act for sabotaging federal space assets. Who is your commanding officer?" Jenkins felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the freezing rain. But his ego, calcified by years of unchecked power, fought back. He couldn't let himself be talked down to, especially not in front of a man he had just handcuffed and thrown in the mud. "Listen here, lady," Jenkins stammered, trying to sound authoritative, but coming off as desperate. "I don't know what kind of scam you two are running, but this man is under arrest for suspicion of narcotics trafficking, and I am confiscating this box as evidence. Now you can tell your story to the judge." "Listen to me very carefully, you incompetent fool," Henrietta cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip through the tiny phone speaker. "I am currently looking at the biometric telemetry of that case. If that seal is broken, humanity does not go to the moon next month. You have exactly 30 seconds to release Dr. Caldwell, put that case gently back into his vehicle, and provide him with an armed escort to the Johnson Space Center. If you refuse, I will consider your actions a hostile domestic threat against a federal asset." "You're threatening a police officer," Jenkins yelled, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm the law out here." "Not tonight, you're not," Henrietta said coldly. "Code red line, Caldwell. We are taking the highway." The line went dead. Jenkins stared at the phone. He looked at David, who was sitting calmly in the back of the cruiser, his expression unreadable. "What the hell was that?" Jenkins demanded, trying to laugh it off. "Code red line? What is she gonna do? Send the space shuttle after me?" David just looked at him, a profound pity mixed with cold satisfaction in his eyes. "You should have looked at the warning labels on the case, Jenkins," David said quietly. "It's not just a NASA property. It's a joint operation with the Department of Defense. You didn't just pull over an engineer. You hijacked a vital piece of national security infrastructure." "Shut up!" Jenkins yelled, tossing the phone onto the front seat of the cruiser. He turned around, determined to prove them all wrong. He grabbed the crowbar again and marched toward the Pelican case. He was going to crack it open, find the drugs, and prove he was right. He raised the heavy steel bar above his head. Before the crowbar could begin its downward arc, the sound of the rain was entirely drowned out by a terrifying, low-frequency mechanical roar. The vibration rattled the teeth in Jenkins's skull. He froze, the crowbar suspended in midair, and slowly turned his head toward the pitch-black southern horizon of Interstate 45. Coming up the northbound lanes, moving the wrong way up the interstate at incredible speed, was a phalanx of matte black, heavily armored SUVs. There were at least 8 of them, their blinding LED light bars piercing the rain like lasers. Above them, the rhythmic, deafening chop of twin helicopter rotors beat the air into submission. 2 matte black Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were flying dangerously low, skimming just 50 feet above the asphalt, their searchlights sweeping the highway. Jenkins dropped the crowbar. It clattered uselessly against the wet pavement. The highway was being shut down, and they were coming exactly to mile marker 112. The physical displacement of air from the twin UH-60 Black Hawks sent a shockwave across Interstate 45. Rainwater blasted sideways in horizontal sheets, creating a localized hurricane that forced Officer Bradley Jenkins to cover his face and stumble backward. The deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of the rotors drowned out the wail of his own cruiser's siren, reducing his perceived absolute authority to absolute insignificance in a matter of seconds. The 8 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans screeched to a halt in a perfect tactical perimeter, effectively boxing in Jenkins's cruiser and David's Audi. The doors of the SUVs flew open before the vehicles had even fully settled on their suspensions. Out poured more than 24 heavily armed tactical agents wearing dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bold yellow lettering of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision. Assault rifles were drawn but pointed at the ground at the low-ready position. Within 5 seconds, Jenkins was surrounded by a wall of federal firepower. "Drop the crowbar and step away from the vehicle," a voice boomed over an amplified megaphone. Jenkins, his uniform soaked through and his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, stared in utter disbelief. He was a state trooper. He owned this highway. But looking at the laser sights, sweeping through the rain, he realized he had just picked a fight with an entity that possessed the power to erase him. He let the crowbar slip from his fingers. It clanged against the wet asphalt. He raised his hands, his palms facing the heavily armed agents. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a drenched FBI windbreaker stepped through the perimeter. He didn't carry a rifle, but his demeanor was sharper than any blade. This was Special Agent in Charge Gregory Pierce of the Houston Field Office's Counterintelligence Division. Pierce was flanked by 2 NASA security operatives who immediately bypassed Jenkins and rushed to the hood of the cruiser to inspect the Pelican case. "Agent Pierce, the biometric seal is intact," one of the NASA operatives shouted over the rotor wash. "No thermal breach. The payload is secure." Pierce let out a short, sharp breath of relief, then turned his attention to Jenkins. The FBI agent's eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of the professional courtesy usually extended between law enforcement officers. "Where is Dr. Caldwell?" Pierce demanded, his voice slicing through the noise. He's in the back of my cruiser," Jenkins stammered, his bravado entirely washed away by the rain and the terrifying reality of the situation. "Listen, I was just conducting a routine traffic stop. This guy was acting suspicious, refusing to comply." "Unlock the car," Pierce interrupted, stepping into Jenkins's personal space. "Now." Jenkins fumbled for his keys with trembling fingers. He stepped to the rear door of his cruiser, unlocked it, and pulled it open. David Caldwell sat in the cramped, smelly back seat, his hand still painfully cuffed behind his back, his expensive suit ruined by the mud Jenkins had dragged him through. Yet his posture remained unbroken. Agent Pierce leaned into the cruiser. "Dr. Caldwell, I am Special Agent Pierce, FBI. Director Lawson sent us. Are you injured?" "Bruised but functional, Agent Pierce," David replied calmly. "More importantly, is the transducer safe?" "It's secure, Doctor," Pierce said. He turned to Jenkins. "Take those cuffs off him. If you hesitate, I will have my agents remove them with bolt cutters, and then I will arrest you for the unlawful detainment of a federal official." Jenkins swallowed hard. His hand shook violently as he inserted the small universal key into the cuffs and released the ratcheting mechanism. The heavy steel fell away, and David stepped out of the cruiser, rubbing his raw red wrists. "Dr. Caldwell," a new voice cut in. From one of the Suburbans stepped a man in the uniform of the State Highway Patrol. It was Captain Robert Hayes, Jenkins's commanding officer. The federal agents had clearly rousted him from his bed, and he looked furious. He glared at Jenkins with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, before turning a respectful gaze to David. "Dr. Caldwell, on behalf of the state of Texas, I am profoundly sorry for this unprovoked outrage. We will handle this." "See that you do, Captain," David said quietly. He didn't gloat. He didn't yell at Jenkins. He simply walked past the disgraced officer as if he didn't exist. One of the FBI agents brought the Pelican case to David. David quickly engaged the biometric scanner. His thumbprint registered, and the LED light flashed a reassuring green. "Let's move, Doctor," Agent Pierce said, gesturing to the lead Suburban. "We have 21 minutes to get you to mission control. We are going to shut down the southbound lanes of I-45 entirely for your convoy. The helicopters will run point." As David slid into the heavily armored federal vehicle, he looked out the window one last time. Jenkins was standing in the rain, stripped of his power, his weapon, and his dignity. Captain Hayes was standing inches from Jenkins's face, screaming at him so loudly that the veins in his neck were visible even in the dark. The convoy of SUVs peeled out, moving perfectly in sync, their sirens wailing as they escorted David Caldwell and the $40 million payload away, leaving Jenkins behind in the chaotic, humiliating aftermath of his own bigotry. By 3:45 a.m., David Caldwell was standing inside the sterile, brilliantly lit Class 100 cleanroom at the Johnson Space Center. Stripped of his ruined suit and clad in a white anti-static hazard uniform, his hands moved with practiced surgical precision. At exactly 3:52 a.m., 8 minutes before the thermal seals were scheduled to permanently lock, David secured the beryllium core transducer into the command module's mainframe. In the observation room above, Director Henrietta Lawson watched the telemetry data stream across the monitors. A collective, massive sigh of relief washed over mission control as the main board flashed green. The Artemis III mission was saved. But while David Caldwell was cementing his legacy in the stars, the absolute destruction of Officer Bradley Jenkins's world had only just begun. For the first 48 hours, Jenkins attempted to rely on the shield that had always protected him, his police union. He sat in a drab conference room in Austin with his union representative, William Barrett, drinking stale coffee and trying to spin the narrative. "It was a dark road, Bill," Jenkins argued, pacing the room. He matched a profile. He was evasive. I had probable cause to detain him and inspect the suspicious cargo. It's a misunderstanding. A suspension with pay, maybe a sensitivity class, and we bury this. Barrett, a seasoned veteran of Union defense, looked down at his phone. He didn't look reassuring. He looked pale. "Brad, this isn't a civil rights lawsuit filed by a public defender. You didn't just rough up a civilian. Do you understand what you actually did?" Before Jenkins could answer, the door to the conference room was pushed open. It wasn't the Internal Affairs Division. It was a team of federal agents led by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, flanked by investigators from the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General's office. They didn't knock. They carried bankers' boxes and federal warrants. "Officer Jenkins," said a sharply dressed DOJ attorney, tossing a thick stack of papers onto the table. "I am placing you under federal indictment." Jenkins froze. "Indictment? For what? A bad traffic stop?" "For starters," the attorney said smoothly, "deprivation of rights under color of law, a violation of Title 18, USC, Section 242. But that's just the appetizer. Because you attempted to forcibly open a highly classified Department of Defense secured payload containing restricted aerospace technology, you are also being charged under the USA Patriot Act for attempted sabotage of critical national infrastructure, and under the Espionage Act for the unauthorized attempted acquisition of classified defense materials." Jenkins's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair. "Espionage? Sabotage? Are you out of your minds? I'm a cop." "You were a cop," the attorney corrected. "As of this morning, Captain Hayes has formally terminated your employment. Furthermore, because this involves national security, standard union protections are nullified. Your body camera footage was seized directly from the precinct servers via a federal warrant at 4 Elgantes a.m. The reality of the situation came crashing down on Jenkins like a concrete vault. The federal government does not play by the rules of local precincts. There was no blue wall of silence that could withstand the sheer, uncompromising force of the Department of Homeland Security and NASA's federal mandates. The DOJ wasn't just coming for Jenkins, they were auditing his entire 12-year career. The sudden spotlight of a federal national security incident forced the local district attorney's office to open their own files to avoid looking complicit. Within a week, the Houston Chronicle broke the story, obtaining the dashcam audio through a FOIA request filed by federal prosecutors. The audio of Jenkins calling one of the nation's top aerospace engineers "boy," followed by his aggressive threats to smash a $40 million piece of space equipment with a crowbar, played on national television. It went viral globally. The public humiliation was absolute. Jenkins became the undisputed face of arrogant, racist incompetence. His wife, unable to bear the intense media scrutiny and the sudden freezing of their assets by federal prosecutors investigating his past seizures, moved out, taking their children to her mother's house in Ohio. His former colleagues at the State Highway Patrol treated him like a leper. Nobody wanted to be associated with the man who almost grounded the lunar mission. Every single minority driver Jenkins had ever arrested, ticketed, or detained over the past decade suddenly had grounds for appeal. The county was forced to allocate millions of dollars to review his past cases, dropping dozens of convictions. He had become a financial and political liability to the state of Texas. Karma had not merely knocked on Bradley Jenkins's door, it had driven a federal tank straight through his living room. 11 months later, the Bob Casey United States Courthouse in downtown Houston became ground zero for the most heavily publicized civil rights and federal security trial of the decade. The sweltering Texas heat outside was entirely contrasted by the freezing, air-conditioned tension inside courtroom 9B. Bradley Jenkins sat at the defense table, looking like a ghost of the man who had once patrolled Interstate 45. He wore a slightly oversized gray suit, his hair thinning, his posture slouched under the collective glare of a packed gallery, a dozen federal prosecutors, and the relentless lens of the national media. Jenkins had retained a high-priced, aggressive defense attorney named Richard Crane, funded by a secretive legal defense fund set up by sympathetic fringe groups. Crane was known for courtroom theatrics and finding microscopic loopholes in federal indictments. For the first 2 days of the trial, Crane systematically attempted to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. His strategy was insidious, but legally calculated. He couldn't deny that Jenkins had made a mistake, but he desperately needed to prove that the mistake was born of legitimate police work, not malicious racial profiling, and certainly not federal sabotage. "Officer Jenkins is a patrolman, not a rocket scientist," Crane boomed during his opening statements, pacing in front of the jury box. When he saw a vehicle speeding, yes, ladies and gentlemen, going 65 in a blinding rainstorm is considered driving too fast for conditions. He executed a lawful stop. When he encountered a driver who refused to open a highly suspicious, heavily fortified container, his training kicked in. We will introduce DEA bulletins showing that the exact make and model of that Pelican case is frequently used by the Sinaloa cartel to transport high-purity fentanyl. Officer Jenkins didn't know he was stopping an aerospace engineer. He thought he was stopping a threat to his community. He is guilty of being overzealous, perhaps, but espionage, sabotage, that is a gross, theatrical overreach by the federal government. The strategy was working to sow a tiny seed of reasonable doubt. Some jurors, ordinary citizens who didn't understand the complexities of federal clearance, nodded slightly. Jenkins sat up a little straighter. The narrative was shifting. Crane was painting him as a blue-collar cop, caught in a misunderstanding with an arrogant federal elite. On the third day, the lead prosecutor for the Department of Justice, Amanda Lewis, called Dr. David Caldwell to the stand. David walked into the courtroom with the same quiet, unshakable dignity he had displayed on the highway. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. He took the oath, sat in the witness box, and adjusted the microphone. Lewis walked him through the events of that night, allowing David to articulate the sheer panic he felt, not for his own life, but for the Artemis III mission. He explained the cryogenic properties of the beryllium core transducer with such clear, undeniable expertise that Crane's cartel lockbox theory began to sound incredibly foolish. But Crane was relentless. On cross-examination, he approached the podium with a predatory smile. "Dr. Caldwell, you hold a PhD from MIT, correct?" Crane asked, his tone dripping with faux respect. "I do," David answered evenly. "You are a highly intelligent man, a man accustomed to giving orders. So, when a simple state trooper asked you to step out of your vehicle, you felt insulted, didn't you? You felt you were above the law." "I felt that the law was being weaponized against me without cause," David replied calmly. "You refused a direct order to open the container," Crane pressed, raising his voice. "You created a standoff. You used the words federal crime and sabotage to intimidate a police officer who was just trying to do his job. If you had simply cooperated, if you hadn't escalated the situation with your defiance, none of this would have happened, correct?" "If I had opened that case," David said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register that forced the entire courtroom to lean in. "The thermal matrix would have shattered. The Artemis III mission would have been grounded. 4 astronauts would have been delayed from returning humanity to the moon, and the American taxpayers would have lost $40 million in a fraction of a second. I did not escalate the situation, Mr. Crane. I prevented a catastrophic failure. I was doing my job," Crane sneered. "A very dramatic narrative, Doctor. But the fact remains, Officer Jenkins had no way of knowing your intentions were pure. He acted on reasonable suspicion in the heat of the moment." Amanda Lewis stood up from the prosecution table. "Redirect, Your Honor?" Judge William Rosenberg nodded. "Proceed, Ms. Lewis." Lewis walked to the center of the room, holding a small digital tablet. "Dr. Caldwell, Mr. Crane has painted a picture of an officer acting in the heat of the moment based on reasonable suspicion. But you are not just a propulsion engineer, are you? You also hold patents in advanced telemetry and security systems?" "Yes. I designed the internal security and data logging arrays for the transport vehicles used by NASA's ground teams," David confirmed. "And is it true you retrofitted your personal vehicle, the Audi A6, with a similar prototype system?" Crane stood up quickly. "Objection. Relevance. Goes directly to the defense's claim of the heat of the moment, Your Honor," Lewis countered. "Overruled." "You may answer, Doctor," the judge said. "Yes," David said. "My vehicle is equipped with a 360-degree continuous loop audio and visual telemetry system. It is designed to activate and permanently lock its data to a secure cloud server the moment the vehicle's collision sensors or emergency proximity sensors are triggered." The color drained from Bradley Jenkins's face. He looked at Crane, panic flaring in his eyes. Crane suddenly looked very small. Lewis tapped her tablet. "Your Honor, the prosecution submits into evidence Prosecution Exhibit 42, the decrypted telemetry and audio files from Dr. Caldwell's vehicle, cross-referenced with the recovered, deleted files from Officer Jenkins's cruiser, which the FBI Cyber Division salvaged from the precinct servers." Lewis turned to the jury. "Let's see what reasonable suspicion sounds like." She pressed play on the courtroom's audio-visual system. The large screens flickered to life. The video showed the dark, rainy highway from the rear-facing camera of David's Audi. The audio was crystal clear, capturing the ambient sound inside the police cruiser as it idled behind David on the highway, a full 2 minutes before the flashing lights were ever turned on. The courtroom listened in dead silence as Jenkins's voice echoed through the speakers. He was on a cell phone talking to another officer. "Yeah, I'm stuck out here on 45. Jenkins's recorded voice grumbled over the sound of the rain. "Dead night. Wait, hold on. Got a fancy little Audi rolling by. Dark windows." The sound of typing could be heard as Jenkins ran the plates. "Registered out of Austin. No warrants. Clean record." A pause. "Name is David Caldwell. Let's pull up the driver's license photo." Another brief pause. Then, the sound of a harsh, ugly laugh filled the courtroom. "Well, look at this. A black guy in an $80,000 car at 1 in the morning. He's probably a runner for the Houston syndicates. I don't care how clean his record is, I'm gonna light his world up. I'm gonna tear that car down to the axles just to watch him sweat." The audio clicked off. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The defense's entire narrative, the cartel bulletin, the heat of the moment, the reasonable suspicion, incinerated in a matter of seconds. It was premeditated, malicious, and entirely rooted in racial prejudice. Jenkins buried his face in his hands. Richard Crane slowly sat down at the defense table, closing his legal pad. He knew it was over. There was no loophole big enough to crawl out of a recorded confession of civil rights violations. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, they didn't even look at Jenkins. Guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty of attempted destruction of government property, guilty of interference with federal operations. 6 weeks later, Judge William Rosenberg presided over the sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed, but the atmosphere had shifted from tense anticipation to a solemn, heavy finality. Before the sentence was handed down, David Caldwell was granted the opportunity to read a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium, looking directly at Jenkins, who was now dressed in a bright Orange County Jail jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to his waist chain. "I am a man of science," David began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I deal in variables, in constants, and in the laws of physics. Gravity does not care about the color of the object it pulls. Thrust does not discriminate. The vacuum of space is indifferent to prejudice. In my world, we are bound by facts and the unified goal of pushing humanity forward." David paused, his eyes locking onto Jenkins's defeated gaze. "But on that highway, Officer Jenkins dragged me out of the future and into a past that this country is still bleeding from." He looked at me, a man carrying the pinnacle of human achievement, and saw only a stereotype. He was willing to destroy billions of dollars of research, endanger the lives of astronauts, and ruin my life, simply to satisfy his own arrogant bigotry. I do not hate Mr. Jenkins. Hatred is a highly inefficient emotion. But I pity him. Because while the rest of us are looking up at the stars, trying to figure out how to get there, men like him are desperately clawing at the dirt, trying to pull everyone else down into the mud with them. I asked the court to ensure he can never pull another citizen down again. Judge Rosenberg, a stern man with decades on the bench, adjusted his glasses. He looked down at Jenkins with a mixture of professional detachment and profound disappointment. "Bradley Jenkins," the judge intoned, his voice carrying the full weight of the federal government. "You were entrusted with a badge and a gun to protect the citizens of this state. Instead, you used your authority as a weapon of intimidation and prejudice. You allowed your personal bias to override your training, your common sense, and the law. Your actions were not merely a lapse in judgment. They were a calculated abuse of power that threatened a vital national security asset. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore." The judge struck his gavel. "On the federal charges of civil rights violations and attempted destruction of federal property, I sentence you to 180 months, 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. Jenkins didn't cry out. He didn't protest. The fight had been entirely drained from him. The heavy clinking of his chains echoed in the silent courtroom as the marshals led him away through the side door, out of the light, and into the dark, mechanical bureaucracy of the federal penal system. 2 years later. September. The Florida sun beat down on the VIP observation deck at the Kennedy Space Center. The air was thick with humidity and electric anticipation. Dr. David Caldwell stood at the railing, wearing a headset, his eyes fixed on the massive, towering structure of the Space Launch System, SLS rocket, 3 miles away on Launch Complex 39B. Inside the Orion capsule, 4 astronauts were strapped in, waiting to break the bonds of Earth. Deep inside the rocket's guidance matrix, nestled in a liquid helium vacuum seal, the beryllium core navigation transducer was humming perfectly, calculating orbital trajectories at billions of computations per second. T-minus 30 seconds, the launch director's voice crackled over the loudspeakers. David smiled, a profound sense of peace washing over him. The grueling nights, the stress, the terrifying incident on Interstate 45, it had all led to this exact moment. Hundreds of miles away, in the Federal Correctional Institution in Beaumont, Texas, the atmosphere was starkly different. Bradley Jenkins sat on a hard plastic chair in the crowded, noisy day room of his cell block. He wore a faded khaki uniform with his inmate number stenciled on the back. The air smelled of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies. Up on the wall, enclosed in a protective steel cage, a small television was tuned to a news network. Jenkins stared blankly at the screen. The image shifted to a live feed of the Artemis 3D rocket. The countdown ticker at the bottom of the screen read T-minus 10 seconds. A younger inmate sitting next to Jenkins leaned forward. "Hey, old man. Ain't that the space thing you got busted over?" Jenkins didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, choked with the ashes of his ruined life. He watched the screen as the massive engines ignited. A brilliant, blinding plume of fire erupted from the base of the rocket, followed seconds later by the deep, chest-rattling roar that vibrated through the television speakers. "Liftoff," the announcer declared. "Liftoff of the Artemis 3, returning humanity to the moon." Jenkins watched the rocket rise, tearing through the blue sky, leaving a trail of pristine white vapor in its wake. It was a monument to human intelligence, perseverance, and unity. It was moving toward the future. The heavy steel doors of the cell block clanged shut behind him, an automated lockdown for the afternoon head count. The sound was brutal, final, and inescapable. Jenkins lowered his head, staring down at his empty hands, hands that had once held power, now holding nothing but 15 years of regret. He realized with crushing clarity that while the man he had handcuffed was currently navigating the stars, he had locked himself in a cage of his own making, left behind in the dark forever. True justice doesn't always arrive immediately, but when karma comes collecting, it hits with the unstoppable force of a rocket leaving the atmosphere. David Caldwell's story is a powerful reminder that dignity, intellect, and truth will always outshine the dark, temporary shadows of prejudice and arrogance. Bradley Jenkins thought he controlled the highway, but he learned the hard way that nobody is above the law. If you were captivated by this incredible story of resilience and ultimate justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic true stories.